This video was brought to you by Ground News. The UK has some of the worst regional inequality anywhere in the developed world. Not only is the southeast significantly richer than the rest of the country, but it also accounts for an outsized fraction of the UK's overall GDP, and few economies are as singularly reliant on a single city as the UK is on London. What makes this predicament particularly acute, however, is that the UK's over-reliance on London seems to be getting worse, not better, with the capital also accounting for an ever-increasing share of well-paid jobs. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the UK's London problem, how it's creating a sort of jobs crisis, and why this presents Labour with a difficult dilemma. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. As we mentioned in previous videos, regional inequality has been a long-standing problem for the UK, with London and the surrounding areas in the southeast being way richer than the rest of the country. Well, the gap has actually closed slightly in the past decade or so. London wages are still way higher than those in the rest of the country, with the median weekly pay coming in at £853, roughly 20% higher than the national average of £728, according to the latest ONS data. On top of this regional pay gap, there's also a regional wealth gap. Again, according to the most recent ONS data, in March 2020, the median household wealth in London stood at about £340,000, roughly 13% above the national average of £300,000. While 13% might not sound like that much, it's largely because London has some of the worst wealth inequality of any region in the UK, which means that the median doesn't take into account quite how wealthy the wealthiest London households actually are. This fact becomes more apparent when you use mean rather than median. By this measure, all but one of the UK's wealthiest regions are either in London or in its surrounding areas. And by far the wealthiest area in the entire country is in inner West London, where the mean wealth stands at £622,000. According to analysis by John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times, London's GDP per capita is roughly 70% higher than the UK's second-place city of Manchester, largely because productivity in London is 32% higher than the national average. And if you removed London, the UK would have a GDP per capita lower than the poorest region, not just in the US, but also in the Netherlands. Now, while a lot of other countries do suffer from a degree of regional inequality, what makes the UK's predicament relatively unique is not just quite how much the UK economy relies on a single city, but also that this reliance has actually been growing over time. In quite a few other countries, regional inequality has actually decreased over the past few years. In the US, for instance, the economic center of gravity has recently moved away from superstar cities like New York and San Francisco towards relative upstarts like Austin in Texas or Denver, Colorado. However, in the UK, the reverse is true. London continues to occupy as central a role in the UK economy as ever, and its share of well-paid knowledge-intensive jobs has actually increased from less than 50% of the UK total in the 2000s to about 75% today. Now, this is bad for at least 4 reasons. Firstly, it's just politically toxic. Understandably, the UK's other regions feel left behind, which is why Boris Johnson's talk of levelling up was so electorally successful back in 2019. Second, it exacerbates the UK's pre-existing housing crisis. If all of the good jobs are in London, this means that any young person who wants to get on in life is basically required to move to the capital. Not only does this mean that all young people have to spend a load of money on housing costs, because London has the least affordable housing in the UK, even once you take the higher wages into account, but this constant influx of job seekers puts further pressure on London's housing market. Thirdly, the fact that only London is really generating significant numbers of well-paying jobs is one of the reasons that the UK has such an acute overqualification crisis, with tons of well-qualified university graduates, but not enough high-skilled jobs, which forces these graduates into low-skill and often poorly paid work. According to an OECD survey published earlier this month, 37% of UK employees aged 25 and over claim that they're overqualified for their jobs, i.e. report having higher education levels than those required by their employer, up from 30% in 2012, and the highest anywhere in the OECD. The fourth problem is that this over-reliance on London has made the UK's economy conspicuously dependent on certain professional service industries, like finance, law, and consulting. These are lucrative and high-growth industries, but they don't employ all that many people, and some commentators worry that the UK's over-reliance on these services has created a sort of service-based Dutch disease. For context, Dutch disease refers to an economic phenomenon which occurs when a country relies too heavily on a single export, which forces up the value of its currency and therefore makes its other export-based industries basically uncompetitive. Usually, this happens when a country's exports rely too heavily on a single commodity, like oil. But there's an argument that the UK is experiencing a similar thing with its professional service industries, like banking and law, which are inflating the strength of the pound and thereby undermining the competitiveness of British manufacturing. And this would explain why manufacturing as a share of UK GDP has fallen consistently since the late 90s and is now well below the international average. So with those four factors in mind, can Labour actually do anything about this? Well, this predicament actually creates at least two further problems for Starmer. The first is that the dynamic we just described will make it harder for Labour to actually achieve its stated ambition of rejuvenating British manufacturing. In their recently published industrial strategy, Invest 2035, Labour say that they want the UK to become a world leader in sectors like advanced manufacturing and clean energy. But this would require creating new, high-productive areas outside of London, and the viability of these industries might be undermined by the Dutch disease dynamics we just described. The second, more general issue is that this creates a sort of fiscal dilemma for Labour. At the moment, London and the South East are the most productive regions in the UK. The quickest and easiest way to boost growth, therefore, is to essentially piggyback on these highly productive areas by, say, building more housing in London, Cambridge, and Oxford, allowing more people to move to these places and take up well-paid jobs. But this would simultaneously retrench the UK's regional inequality. In the long term, it will probably be both more politically and economically sustainable to invest in the UK's left-behind regions, helping them to at least partly catch up with London. But this will be both expensive and incur a short-term hit to growth, which neither Labour nor the British electorate would be all that keen on. And although the London problem does present a major dilemma for Labour, it's far from the only fiscal problem that the UK faces at the moment, with the UK's economy actually contracting by 0.1% in October, despite this government's real focus on growth. Now, this issue has been covered extensively by more than 92 news outlets. 22% of this reporting comes from the left, while 44% is coming from the right. And if you compare the headlines, you start to see some interesting framing emerge, with right-wing outlets hammering the Chancellor on this issue, and even claiming that this might be evidence of an incoming recession. And this is all possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organize them by story, with each coming with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean left, you may have missed this story about North Korean special forces accidentally killing 8 Russian troops in Ukraine. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers every story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 50% off Ground's Vantage plan, which includes access to all of their amazing features, like their blind spot feed. This is their biggest discount of the year, so go to ground.news/TLDR, scan the QR code on screen, or use the link in the video description to subscribe today.